I'm Jim Check,
And I'm Renee Merrifield.
and here we are with Beyond the Ballot. So much to talk about today. Holy cow. And we'll start in BC because that's what you're most familiar with. And the BC budget was put out yesterday. Any first thoughts on that?
Oh, I would say it was put out yesterday and it sounded like a thud. 10.9 billion, $11 billion deficit, the largest ever in recorded history for BC. I'm sure that is going to have an echo on on our ratings and on being downgraded on our credit rating. This is a budget that was much ado about nothing. It's basically we're going to keep our foot on the gas. We don't really have a path forward. We're not about economic gain or potential, and it's a scary budget. I saw a tweet yesterday from one of the opposition MLAs that said, we're now up to $38,000 of debt for every man, woman, and child in BC. That's staggering and very scary. 5 cents on every dollar that is collected by the NDP is going towards interest costs right now. Again, just scary numbers, big numbers, and really did not have a direction forward. Did not have any spending that would really stimulate our economy.
Yeah, what was missing for me is like where's the investment into infrastructure projects or into mining or into forestry or into oil and gas, LNG? Where was that? Because what I heard was a lot of like doom and gloom, and maybe that's what they want. They were talking about a GDP forecast for 2025 of 1.8, which is up from 1.2, which is pretty abysmal for a resource-rich province. And then, like they're talking about, like 45,000 job loss by 2029, and then unemployment at 6.7% until 2026. I mean, this is a pretty, the only bright spot in the whole thing, $110 rebate for ICBC.
Yeah, and that was what the finance minister was tweeting about yesterday. Instead of tweeting about her budget, she's out there tweeting about the ICBC $110 back. And really, when every person realizes that they've just gone $10,000 more in debt on behalf of the government of BC, that's a pretty scary number.
They
And
should go with, yeah, they should
dropping.
go with the slogan, promises made, promises not kept. Because, like the $1,000 grocery rebate taken away. That was the one. That was one of their strong points of the election. And that was the one they went after John Rustad for, and said that because John Rustad had a rental rebate program, and then they said, "Oh, he won't deliver that in time. We'll give you $1,000 right now. That'll go immediately into your pocket and help you with groceries and inflation." Not happening. And then the
Yeah.
other promise that they made is that they're going to keep the EV no tax on used EVs, and that was supposed to go for another 2 years. Turns out that's ending on May 1, and that was
Yes.
announced as well. So they needed
Yes.
that money as well.
What
And
is going up though is the revenue from the carbon tax. Again, that is one of their cash cows, and they're going to keep that one coming in for as long as they possibly can. Other things that went up: speculation tax, the foreign buyers tax, the occupancy tax. So we're looking at some really big taxations that are not even a drop in the bucket, not even able to offset what the deficit is looking like this next year.
And the other one, the odd one, we've got quite a few emails on this. This is really odd. When they put out their Airbnb rules, they said that people had to register with the municipal governments, and like there's a city of Kelowna where people registered and they paid the registration fee, like a business license, and they registered. Now there's also a provincial registry. Like why is there two registries? And like they're $100 for the primary, secondary suite is $450 annually, and then the Strata Hotel is $600 annually. Again, it seems like another unnecessary tax grab when there's already a registry that they could tap into if they needed to.
Yes, I think this is about enforcement. And I think that the province wants to enforce it, but in order to enforce it, they're going to have to employ people and they're going to have to find some offsets. And this is one of the ways that they're going to do it. The other offset that they're going to look for are the fines, and actually putting those fines into making sure that they can continue to enforce this very, what I would call nonsensical and unnecessary Airbnb ruling.
Yeah, and the same thing, when they talk about that, it's all about like carbon. That's why they're doing this carbon tax and everything about climate change and everything. And then, like they had given that EV credit for used. There shouldn't be any used tax anyway, right? Because every other province doesn't have it. Used vehicles are not taxed across, I don't know if every province, but they're not taxed in Alberta at all. Because there is no GST on a used vehicle, but in BC there is PST on used vehicles, but they had given that exemption for used electric vehicles, but they've taken that away now, 2 years early.
Yeah, and that was surprising. This budget is certainly, I can't imagine the Greens being happy with it. The budget literally does not have anything additional for Clean BC. It actually takes away and stagnates the carbon tax rebate that they had touted for, as being something that was going to follow CPI and make sure that it stayed. Going back to British Columbians. And I'll remind, all of the listeners here that that EV, or sorry, that rebate that is given is the lowest in all of Canada. BC actually receives the lowest amount in all of Canada back from government as to what we pay out in carbon tax. So that recessive tax regressive tax is actually very significant in the pockets of British Columbians. It's one of the reasons that our cost of living is so high, and one of the reasons that our inflation remains above the rest of Canada.
So two of our biggest industries in British Columbia, mining and forestry, and it used to be the other way around, mining the leader now in forestry. And there's a response from Kofi saying that they're disappointed with the absence of dedicated support for the forest sector. And the forest sector will be particularly hit hard with all these tariffs, right? Softwood has always been kind of attacked, right? And there was no help there for the forest sector, and really no path forward when they're talking about access to fiber and like the tariffs and the stumpage costs.
And EB has not negotiated on behalf of the lumber industry. Those softwood tariffs should be negotiated away. He has not done that. They have remained in place for the entire duration of the BC NDP. And I was having a conversation the other day with someone, and they were talking about how our industry leaders like the Canfors and the Tolkos were shutting down and going out of business. And I'm like, they're not going out of business. They're going out of BC. Very different story, and how they're going to the US, and how the US is really ratcheting up lumber production, and how that won't be as much of an issue for their housing industry, regardless of what tariffs they decide to put on the lumber that's coming from Canada. They just won't need as much, because we're seeing the companies take off down there, and at much lower rates, and at much higher productivity and profitability rates. I'll remind everyone that it was just last week that Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, came out and said, what we need to do is see stimulus on our economy. We need to see an increase in productivity, and we need to see interprovincial trade barriers decreased. The BC government, the NDP, were the first ones out of the gate on they could actually do something. They are in session right now, and instead of doing anything meaningful against the tariffs that we're experiencing with Trump, they literally just said, okay, we're just going to do more of the same, and we're not going to respond in any meaningful way.
Yeah, so the lumber industry, and we've done so many stories on forestry, is one of their biggest complaints was certainty and predictable access to fiber. And they're saying that this does not give them any of that certainty that they're looking for. And Canfor, one of the reasons they did not go forward with their Houston planned expansion there, and they closed Bear Lake, and then they curtailed shifts in Prince George, because it said BC lacks certainty, and it's just not a province that they're willing to invest in right now.
Well, and the Liberals are taking, the NDP are taking this and touting this as a big Trump, expose, and how it's all about Trump and all about, the tariffs. But really, Tolko came out last week with a statement, and, they're cutting their jobs in Vernon. And it says, and I quote, not because of Trump, but because of BC policy and regulatory burden causing high costs and limiting access to available economic fiber for our BC manufacturing facilities that are continuing to impact our BC footprint. This is not about tariffs. And the companies and our industry has been sounding the alarm bell. They need to do it louder, and I'm encouraging them all to do that through their associations. But they have to push back on this NDP that is not investing in their future.
And that's been echoed by AP planners that had that mill in Merritt, and that's been echoed by Canfor. And these are large forestry companies. And the other side of that coin, which is so puzzling, is that wildfire is one of the biggest risks in British Columbia. And with active BC companies of forestry managing our forests better, we would have less forest fires as well. So it just seems like it doesn't make any sense. Like, it just doesn't make any common sense why we don't involve our forestry companies more to give them access to more fiber so we have younger forests.
Well, again, we've had 7 years of the NDP, 8 years almost of the NDP as of May. And in that 8 years, they have been unable to create a meaningful forestry management plan moving forward. Without that, we will not be able to see our forestry companies have any level of certainty. And without certainty, you're not going to see investment dollars. And whether that's in the housing industry, the mining industry, or the forestry sector, money is leaving, and it's leaving in droves. And just this morning I was on a podcast that was talking about companies that are opening up in the US to avoid the tariffs. We're going to see a flee of capital, and you and I've talked about that sucking sound, with the dollars fleeing out of Canada. But right now, out of BC is happening in droves, and I'm going to predict that these tariffs will affect BC, and we don't have reserves, we don't have the ability to respond financially, and so we're gonna see a recessionary pressure being put on our economy this next year.
Yeah, Premier Eby used the two excuses, saying that the reason they're not giving the $1,000 grocery rebate was because of the investment capital fleeing the province, and two, the Trump tariffs. The capital was already leaving prior to this. It's been leaving for like 3 years.
It's Pembina, they stated at the BC Business Council last year that the reason that they came to BC was because of the political environment. The reason they're leaving BC is because of the political environment. If we do not change what our policies are, we will continue to see that flee of capital. It's very simple, and without a change in government, we're not gonna see it come back.
Yeah, and I think the other one I somehow slipped my mind there was the dollar. They said the Canadian dollar had been falling. Actually, the dollar had recovered a little bit after, because the dollar had been falling for about a year, and then it had actually dropped when the first time they mentioned tariffs, but it had recovered from there. So both of those excuses don't really hold water.
Agreed. And this government is still not responding to what it needs to. They're not providing the infrastructure that's necessary to see even their policies come to fruition. And whether that's in the housing market, you saw the headlines this last week about Kelowna being out of power in certain areas, developers being told with buildings that are almost completed that they're not going to get energized for 2 or 3 years, projects being shelved because of that fear that there's not going to be enough electricity, not being able to meet the mandates that we have with necessary charging stations or with the necessary amount of electricity. And all the while, we're bringing in electricity at $1.4 billion a year and climbing. And that's from Alberta and from Washington, which are coal burning and natural gas burning. So
Yeah.
why we can claim that in some way, shape, or form that we're actually doing something positive for the environment is beyond me. We need to get out of the way of the market and let market demand dictate, and let the capitalism actually see its way through the quagmire that we're in.
We have to be really careful too in the rhetoric that the politicians are putting out there right now. Doug Ford saying, "I'm going to turn the lights off," because what if Washington turns our lights off? And then what if they turn off our oil and gas? Because our pipeline that goes east to west actually goes through the United States. So what if they say, "Well, I ain't going through here"? So we have to be, when we're threatening to turn off the lights, they can turn off. Our economies are so intertwined, right? They're so intertwined. So I think on both sides need to really dial back the rhetoric right before we end up in a really bad spot. So this is the big one, is that we still have interprovincial trade barriers. And this is one of the, Peter Millibar says, like, why don't we get rid of these trade barriers? Because Pierre Poilievre has brought it up many times too, is like, our biggest trading partner is right here in Canada, except we have barriers in the way.
And this is something that's been brought up for decades. There's been a certain task force that have been struck, certain interprovincial, and there's the 4 Western provinces that got together to try and tackle some of these particular issues, but it really needs to be directed federally, where you take away the powers that the provinces have to block each other and each other's goods and services. That's what we need right now. We need a strong federal government that is going to tackle those interprovincial barriers. Tiff Macklem was very clear that that is what was necessary in order for us to start trading with ourselves and to decouple from the United States. Why we are not doing this yet is beyond me. It doesn't make any sense. And right now, when we are in crisis, would be a logical time to try and take the egos and put them aside and the political agendas, and then actually put forward some great trade initiatives for the rest of Canada.
The Greater Vancouver Board of Trade gave the budget letter grade of a C minus, and expanded its report card to give the Trump tariffs a letter grade of F, and said this budget did not deliver economic incentives, tax changes, or programs or policy shifts that are required to kickstart our economy, which we have been advocating for since before the last election. And that's what you started with, saying, like, where's the incentives? Where's the incentives and the draw for capital? Where's the incentives to get people to invest here instead of the United States? Because right now there's so many incentives to go south with your money if you have large capital, because it's low taxes, less regulation, fast tracking. And here, fast tracking, what does fast tracking mean for a mine here in Canada? What are we talking now?
12 years?
10, 12 years. Yeah, that's fast tracking. Like so many things. And access to fiber. Like, I interviewed Premier Eby on that same thing. He said, Jim, yeah, we can do better. Well, then do better, right?
Do better.
Then do better. Just start doing better. Like, there's a documentary out there from Marin saying they can't even get access to burnt wood. They can't even get the permits for burnt wood, like, that has a best before date. Like, if they can't cut that, I don't know if it's 1 or 2 years, that it's just basically just chips at that point then.
Oh yeah, it's useless. Actually, they can't even process it. So you're right. This government does not know how to activate, does not know how to stimulate the economy. What we saw go up in any way, shape, or form in this was social programs. By a measly 4%, healthcare by 4.5%. Again, we're not seeing a greater delivery of these. We're not seeing less issues or needs on our streets. Why? Because our economy has been, failing over the course of the last 2 years in particular, but I would even claim 3, bolstered only by the 4 mega projects, which are all now winding down. And we are going to see a greater increase in our unemployment rate, and we are not seeing the necessary economic stimuli. The other ones that were really left out of this budget were small businesses. The small businesses that are dying the death of 1,000 cuts, and all of the extra taxation and pressures that they're experiencing right now. There was no relief in this budget. And I'm not even saying like relief in terms of support, just to get out of the way, to tax them less, to see some sort of a reprieve on what they're experiencing. And this budget had absolutely nothing for them.
The former Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, before she resigned, said that it's been 10 lost years with the Liberals because of virtue signaling, identity politics. Is some of that possibly the case for the NDP, focusing on those types of issues as opposed to how to grow our economy?
Well, the NDP have always been very strong on the social issues. And I think that, a centrist government would say, hey, our heart is on our left. We care about those that are in need, but our pocketbook's on our right. And we have to get an economy moving forward if we want to pay for all those social programs. That's the part that the NDP miss. They don't know how to pay for it. They don't know how to do business. They don't know. And, even looking out across, when I was a former MLA, looking out across that aisle and looking at the different MLAs that were on the NDP side, very few of them had ever run a business. Very few of them had ever signed a paycheck, did not know how to build a business case or a business plan. So it's no wonder that they don't understand how to stimulate the economy. But having said that, they are in government right now. And the only way that we're going to see that, I think, shift or change is if we see a shift or change in government. And we're up for another 4 years of this. And it's going to be scary times, especially with an adversary like Trump sitting across our border.
Housing targets. I know that the Liberals have said, the Liberal government, like the federal government, has said that they have these lofty housing goals of 650,000 starts a year, when I think the record year was in the 250s or something like that range. And I think last year was 227. But a lot of that housing targets is in BC though too.
and the housing targets were not met last year. They will not be met again. The NDP, the only program that has worked was CMHC. CMHC program is now changing. So that's going to have a dramatic effect on the purpose-built rentals that we're seeing in our own city. And if you look at the numbers for where we're at on our housing starts, people look around and go, well, we're seeing rental incentives now being offered, and we're seeing all these new buildings coming to fruition, which is very true. And we do see new buildings coming to fruition. We do see a rental vacancy increase, which is all part of being a healthy city. But what we fail to realize is the building starts, especially in Kelowna, have plummeted over this last year, and we are sitting at numbers that we haven't seen since 2016. That's a very scary time, and it really means that we are going to fail on the housing crisis. And I've been asked, like, well, what should we do? What should government do at this point? And I would say, stop villainizing the housing industry. Stop villainizing those that are investing in the housing industry, because you have to have that investment in order to move it forward. Yeah, it's very capital intense. Banks do not move forward until you have deposits in the bank and pre-sales moving forward. And right now that is not being encouraged, and people don't have enough money to even pay for their needs to be met, never mind a down payment on a home, and they're not meeting the stress test with higher interest rates. So we have a real perfect storm when it comes to housing, and I don't see any reprieve. And this NDP government only put $318 million into the coffers for housing. So while they're increasing social programs and trying to keep people supported, they're not actually fixing the problem, which is getting more housing built.
It even goes to the smaller investor that bought that Airbnb property, where we're seeing in Kelowna where people are buying Airbnbs, and then they took that away from them. And now people don't know what to do. They can't carry the mortgages and all kinds of things. So it definitely doesn't bode well for somebody to say, well, I'll buy another investment property in Kelowna.
No, why would you? Just like the sucking sound that we hear in the forestry industry or the mining industry, it is in the housing industry. It just looks different in the housing industry. So, we are seeing that there is no optionality when it comes to housing, and we're looking at very few ways that you can exit out of a housing purchase in a meaningful way, other than to lose your shirt. So it's not looking great. Airbnb properties typically were not, and I mean, Stats Canada did a great analysis last July on that very, very issue, and said that only 0.05%. That is so minuscule of an amount of housing that was on the Airbnb market was appropriate for long-term rental.
Yeah, and I did the interview with Brenda Bailey, and she said, oh, Jim, we got to go after those people that own 27 of these Airbnbs. They're running these big, huge businesses. And when I talked to Airbnb, the head of Airbnb here in Canada, he said, actually 90 to 95% of the people that have an Airbnb have one. Right? They aren't large corporations and stuff like that. So again, they use one example to vilify the whole industry. And then it's really hurt families too. It's hurt our tourism industry. It's hurt so many different sectors. And yet, they still keep running on the same mandate here.
Totally agreed. So we have to do something. We have to do something radical. And people need to get noisy. They need to let this NDP government know that things are not all well, and that just by increasing the rental subsidy is not going to make ends meet by the end of the day, and it's not going to get people ahead. It's like you're giving them a fish but not teaching them how to fish, or letting them into the pond where they could actually fish. So we need to a greater focus on that, and this was not coming from the NDP whatsoever.
Finance critic Peter Millibar points out a few things, and he said that one of the things, they're going ahead with that carbon tax we talked about, 3.3 cents a litre on April 1, making it more expensive to fill up your tank. And again, that carbon tax, remind people, it's a compounding carbon tax, right? Because it gets added on throughout the process. So if you take like sometimes 10 times, 15 times as a product is being made and shipped to market and transported, then you finally buy it. So that is a compounding carbon tax. And ironically, they put that, like we just talked about, they put the sales tax back on used vehicles. Again, in Alberta, if you go buy that same vehicle in Alberta, if you're buying a $50,000 car, In BC, that'll cost you $6,000 because the PST starts at 12% in BC. It'll cost you $6,000 more than buying that car in Alberta. Like an Albertan can buy that car, a used car, for $6,000 cheaper.
Well, the other thing that the PST on used vehicles doesn't take into account is what the actual value of the vehicle is or what you bought it for. So if you got a great deal on it, they don't really
Yeah.
care. They're going to charge it based on what the blue book value is, and that whether that car's been in an accident or not, whether it's engine is blown or not, it doesn't matter. They want to charge you full pop for the PST on that vehicle. So in some cases, the PST was actually costing more than the vehicle itself, because they had valued it at a much higher level.
You,
So, this government has to tax. If they do not tax, they will go farther into debt because they are on a spending frenzy that has no sight, no stopping in sight. So I think that we're in a really dangerous and very precarious situation here. And as our downgrades take off, and we see that as a province, we're going to see higher and higher interest costs and less ability to actually, fund those deficits.
I actually interviewed one of the heads of the BC Car Dealers Association, and he said something that was really troubling. He said buying it like like if you're buying an SUV, some of the SUVs are in the $100,000 range. If you're buying an SUV in BC versus buying it in Alberta, there can be up to a $32,000 difference in the price tag. So he says what some people are doing is actually going and buying a property in Alberta and getting an Alberta driver's license and buying the vehicle in Alberta and avoiding the $32,000 instead of like giving it away as taxation. They use it as an investment in Alberta. He said that's happening a lot. So there's
Oh yeah.
something wrong when if you as a like you're buying like an SUV, that's a typical family vehicle for Canadians if you're up living in a climate and getting kids to hockey, all that kind of stuff. If you have to pay $32,000 more than the Albertan pays for that same vehicle, and then Albertans don't have a PST on used vehicles, and that PST, which is typically 7%, actually starts at 12 on used vehicles, which is why 12 instead of like 7 even, right?
Well, and with our EV mandates, our EV mandates are more stringent and stricter than even the state of California, which is a far left leaning jurisdiction. And when you look at those, the difficulty with that is, well, if I can't find a gas powered vehicle that that I need up in Dawson Creek, where there's one charger for all of the population surrounding, well, what's going to happen is that you're going to see people going to the U.S., which is a 45-minute drive right across from the border. You're going to see them actually go there to buy that vehicle that they cannot buy in BC. And again, it's going to hurt the entire car industry. We're seeing, dealerships really weighing their options and thinking twice about staying open. Is it better for them just to shut down? And here again is the virtue signaling and the cost adding that doesn't actually result in any emissions lowering. In the city of Dawson Creek, I saw a Toyota dealership that was mandated to put in an EV charger. So they were doing their darndest and trying to put in that EV charger. They had a letter from BC Hydro that said, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to provide you with the 3-phase power that you require because we don't have it available in that area. So we suggest that you use alternative methods to power your charger. And when they responded back and said, well, what alternative methods are those? It was suggested that they either use wind or diesel.
Yeah, I was going to say a diesel generator.
You tell me, up in Dawson Creek, are you going to be using wind to power that 3-phase charger? I don't think so. I think you're going to be using diesel. So they literally had a diesel powered charger. And that, I mean, it's the most ridiculous thing ever that does not result in any lowering. Those EVs are now all powered on diesel.
And with the United States dropping the EV mandates there, I would say to Ontario auto manufacturers that are scared of the tariffs, which they got a break from today. There's no tariffs for a month at least on automobiles. That if they don't change the EV mandates here in Canada, those auto manufacturers are leaving anyway, because there's some relaxation even in Europe today on climate emissions, that they're saying like a big Honda plant being built. I think one of the largest plants is being built in the United States because Honda really not moving into the EV world is now saying the United States is a friendly place for them to start building their cars.
Yeah, and this is scary for us. Again, we're not talking about an unnecessary item. I understand that the Lower Mainland believes that everyone has access to transit in the same way that they do, and it just simply is not true. The echo chamber of Victoria as well has one of the highest transit userships, but that is because of availability and accessibility. We do not have that outside of a very small portion of the Lower Mainland. People drive, and they require those vehicles for their work, for their mobility, to make sure that their kids can get to school, etc. And especially more so in the rural and remote areas, to require everyone for EVs is just borderline ridiculous. And while we might believe that in the end, alternative fuels is a great way to go, this is not the way to get there. And these mandates are being shown around the world to not be effectual, and that's why you're seeing them dropped. The other thing that's being shown to be not very effectual is Airbnb legislation, and you're seeing New York on the debate floor right now trying to figure out whether or not they're going to be keeping their Airbnb legislation, because they've seen rental rates is continue to climb, and their tourism ministry crippled without the Airbnbs. So it's really not making the difference that they thought it would.
I mean, I really like EVs. I drive one, but I also think people need to have a choice. People should buy one because they think they're, better, not because it's just like it should be because it's a choice that you get to make on your own, and it suits your lifestyle and it suits the community you live in. It should never be forced upon us, because that is definitely the wrong way to go about it. And right now we're probably going to see some really negative repercussions if we're forcing it here in Canada and it's not being forced in the United States. It'll just, again, that giant sucking sound, and people will be leaving to there to invest their capital. We've gone. What's that?
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
It's not just that. It's the cost of living. EVs cost more. And without the incentives from the federal and the provincial governments, and the tax, and the rebates, we're seeing that it's expensive to do so. We also don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the electricity. So it's expensive to add that charger. It's expensive to fund that power. So until things become cost effective, you're going to see people leave because it's just simply unaffordable to live here. And we're seeing our kids in the next generation make choices to go to places like Alberta or Saskatchewan because they can afford to have a house or to have mobility. And that's scary times for our next generation and for our creative capital, and certainly something that we have to really think about and look twice at.
There's a lot of young people playing that song "Alberta Bound," that's for sure.
Yeah,
it's even if they didn't like country, they're probably playing that in their truck. We've gone over our 30 minutes, but we have a couple more things if you have time, just to touch on the Liberal leadership race. Obviously, that's the big vote is Sunday, I think, right?
Yeah, the coronation.
Yeah, the coronation happens on Sunday.
Yeah.
I
do want to draw attention to the polls. Leger put out a poll just yesterday that showed the Conservatives back in 13-point lead ahead of Carney. So I do think that it's going to the tarnish is going to start there. I have to say I've never seen and I know that I've been on my soapbox a little bit about females in politics, but Christy Clark said something wasn't true, found out, receipts delivered, she resigned because she
chased her out.
They chased her out. Carney, on the other hand, not once, not twice,
covered
but now
for him
3 different times. Yeah. And we've got the CBC that's trying to cover for him. We've got reporters that are trying to make justifications for why he sat at that board meeting, made that call, and then lied about it on a stage. I do not understand why anyone would want a leader that is so able to lie and mislead the public in that manner.
And I don't know if you know, Renee, but Canada is the leading producer of semiconductors, and we're the leading seller of those semiconductors to the United States.
Yeah, so about that, I think we're actually number 20 that on that list. I do not think that we are a leader in any way, shape, or form. Last week, our economy was really weak. That's why we needed Carney this week. He's saying that our economy is really strong. I
Yeah.
don't even know what fundamentals he's talking about, but I think it's more of a concern for me that we really haven't had full disclosure on Carney as a leader. So scary times on Sunday. Yes, we've got Trudeau not knowing when he's actually going to
That
be.
comment, I'm just like, what? I put that on my LinkedIn because they asked him when he's leaving because the vote the counting of the vote is on March 9th, and he's like, well, I'm not sure. That it's complicated. How is it complicated?
I don't
There's a new
understand.
leader on March 9th.
You
Isn't
should
that
be.
today?
But as I had said earlier, that Carney wants him to stay on as the interim prime minister, and that Carney would actually never become prime minister. So, if my prediction is true or accurate, it also means that Carney will not have to perform any disclosure or conflict of interest disclosure. So, again, scary times. We don't really fully understand who could be behind some of his decisions or some of the things that he does. But right now, it's showing that the Conservatives would have a majority and a pretty strong majority at
That
that.
that'll be one of the sneakiest things they've done if they don't if he doesn't resign on March 9th. That will blow most Canadian mind. I think it will not go well for the Liberal Party either. I think that will really tarnish what's going on because we prorogued government for so long. Well, we've had one of the biggest economic crises in our modern times, and because of this big leadership race, and if he doesn't even take power on that day, that will be just, I think, way too much for way too many people. And the other caution I'd say to people, when he talks about these lies, he says they're mischaracterizations, or the CBC said they're couch truths and stuff. I would remind people that if anybody is really careful with their language, it's bank governors, right? The Bank of Canada governor, the the U.S. Fed governor. They're very careful because every word means so much to them. When they do
Yeah.
their releases because they know that the market hangs on every word, whether you're dovish or you're hawkish or whatever. So they know that words matter.
Absolutely. And Carney is a skilled orator. He is someone that has been in the public eye for decades. So for him to have misappropriated words, no way. I don't believe it for 1 second.
Yeah.
And there is no misappropriation when you say I wasn't involved in that decision. I was no longer at the board table, and you were sitting there making the decision as the chair. That
Sign
just
the
makes
letter. Sign the letter.
sign a letter to move the headquarters
Sign the letter.
doesn't make sense. And if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck
Looks
and
like a
quacks like
duck.
a
Yeah.
duck, yeah, it's
And
a
then
duck.
Trump comes out and accuses, they had a conversation today, Trump and Trudeau, and Trump accuses Trudeau of using the trade war to stay in office and never let the Liberals, for sure, are really good at using an existential crisis, as I like to say. There's been a lot of those, to keep power, for you not to allow you to criticize government, criticize institutions. We've heard this so many times over the past 4 years of like, you're not allowed to say anything negative. I've even had some people say to me, hey, Jim, you got to really, this is not a time to criticize this government. When is the time?
We as the public have to hold government to account, and the government of the day and the way our parliamentary system is set up is simply for opposition, for that dialogue, for that debate, and it's intrinsic within the system. And we have to understand that that's going to require conversations exactly like these, where there's a critique of government and an acknowledgement that accountability is necessary. And right now we don't have that. And the scariest thing is that if Carney does leave Trudeau in, we literally have a lame duck who is not no longer the leader, and we have a leader who is not elected. That's a scary time because they are not then subjected to the people, and that's what needs to happen in very short order.
Yeah, we'll end it off with a couple of thoughts on the Trump's address, President Trump's address last night to Congress. Um, it was a longer address. The one of the things that stuck out to me though was where I seen the funny part was the Democrats had the paddles, like they were voting in like in an auction or something that they were bidding. It was kind of like, seemed like really childish, and they had calling. concerted effort with that. But one of the things that you think you would have got Bernie Sanders' positive reaction is one of the things that I think would be great in Canada: no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security benefits. Imagine that in Canada, no tax on CPP and OAS, how that would help seniors like right now.
Huge.
And no tax on overtime. How many people would be willing to work harder? Because lots of people refuse overtime because they say, well, I'm just giving half of it away in taxation, right? So no tax on overtime would be huge for Canadians, and no tax on tips would really help our serving industry, where it's hard to get people to go into that industry sometimes. Those three things I think would be like such a great thing for Canada, and hopefully, like a guy like Pierre Poilievre is listening and would kind of take on those things. That's what we hope to hear from David Eby, was ways to incentivize people to invest capital into BC, like get people to buy homes. Like, I mean, again, going back to your point there, the cranes are coming down in Kelowna, but they're not going back up.
They're not going back up. They're not going back up, and development takes years to actually get underway. So if you don't see them today, it's going to be 2 to 3 years before you'll see any again. And just to that point, last night's address, the only time that Democrats really showed any sort of life outside of booing Trump was when Trump was talking about how much money had already been spent in the Ukraine. Obviously, there's differing opinions, but it wasn't actually the Ukraine that they were clapping at. It was the spend that they were clapping at, which I think really belies where that government had been, which was on a spending frenzy that needed to be tamed. I think that's what Trump is reacting to with the tariffs. I think he's trying to make money for government quickly because I think they're running out of money. And I think it's a scary time for the U.S. I think it's a scary time for Canada. And the more desperate the U.S. becomes, the more difficult a position that Canada is in, because desperate times make people and leaders do very desperate things, including, trying to become, take over and make their neighbors the 51st state. So I think that we need to be eyes wide open. I think that there are some really scary times ahead of us, and I'm not sure if the pressure will come economically or if it will come from a security standpoint, but either way, it's going to be a difficult time for Canada.
Well, you watch capital and you watch the markets, and the markets don't seem to believe the tariffs are going to be that tough of a thing. Like, we see that the Canadian dollar not really reacting, and then the stock market actually starting to, like, it looked at positive reaction today. And you see where people are going to put their dollars right now, and a lot of that capital, like we say that giant sucking sound over and over again, is capital is fleeing to the United States, and that's not good for Canada, right? So this budget put out by the NDP definitely doesn't give any reason for somebody to pause and say, hey, you know what, I can invest in BC. I think that's what's missing right now. I think Danielle Smith in Alberta is giving Albertans a reason to invest in Alberta, because obviously it is one of the biggest contributors to our national GDP. It is clearly, and then you and I talked prior to going on, there's a really good map put out by Francois Philippe Champagne, a Liberal MP, that highlights how much of an impact Alberta and Saskatchewan play in our energy sector in Canada. And then they've been crippled, and like roadblocks are put in their way. Imagine what they could contribute if they were let go, if they were unleashed.
Yeah. The best line I heard was last night, where someone said, well, the NDP are going to give us $110 rebate from ICBC. And a gentleman at the table said, oh, and he, young, like in his 20s, but said in response, that's why you need to move to Alberta, because they're giving you that $110 from what you've already given them. But in Alberta, they're giving you $1,500 from what they've made from the oil and gas sector in their economy. So I think that was like very appropriately stated, in that that's what even our younger adults are seeing right now, is that the NDP are in trouble.
So one of the things Alberta has that nobody else has in Canada is a sovereign wealth fund. And that's the only province that packs that. And there's many nations that pack it, Norway, one of them. And Norway built theirs on oil and gas, and they're very clean EV state too, but $300,000+ per capita in the sovereign wealth fund, all off of oil and gas. And Alberta, it has a lot of money in there too, not near what Norway has. But again, the Saudis with a sovereign wealth fund, which is the biggest in the world, and it's all built on oil and gas, and what we could do if we unleashed it.
there was an interesting graph that showed what Alberta's sovereign wealth fund would look like if they hadn't been subjected to equalization payments, and how large it would actually be. And I think that that's the telling thing, is that Alberta has been a good neighbor, and we are not seeing that in response back.
Yeah, and then if we had access to sell our oil in other markets instead of having to sell it at a discount to the United States, again with the East-West pipeline and the Northern Gateway pipeline, because people don't realize too, it's not just about getting access to those things for selling. We would actually get a higher price for oil and gas because we only have one customer, so we've always been selling our oil and gas at a discount.
Yeah. And then the East-West pipeline actually has access to a refinery. And some have said, well, it's not equipped to refine our type of oil. And there was actually a proposal that was done under Harper's government where that refinery would have revamped itself in order to refine the bitumen that comes out of Alberta, and it would have been a very, very successful endeavor. And again, yesterday and today, we see the premier of Quebec and coming out and saying it's not going to happen because we don't want the oil and gas. It's like, you guys import it from Saudi every single day. It's unreal.
And Russia. They've actually, I think it was $200 million that we bought from Russia. So we're funding the war two ways. We're funding the Ukraine side of it, and we're funding the Russian side of it. So we're actually funding the war at both ends.
Agreed.
Crazy. We've taken a lot of your time today. This is longer than we typically go, but there was so much to get through, and we're very thankful for your time, Renee. It's it's lots to talk about, and it's a lot of dinner table talk right now, right? People are worried and what's going on, right? So we're very thankful for your time.
No, thank you.
All right, and we thank you for watching Kelowna Now.